So this is the July Conservation Partnership meeting on fireflies, and we are here with Dr. Clyde Sorensen. And during his 28-year career at NC State, he's taught entomology classes to over 8,000 students. His research interests range from the biology and management of agricultural pests to the response of native bee communities to prescribed fire and the reproductive ecology of the Venus flytrap. So several years ago, his interest in fireflies was renewed, and he has been on the hunt ever since for what may be a new species of firefly. And he's had some really great articles helping to promote fireflies in the last couple of years. And I went to Grandfather Mountain. I entered the lottery to go see the ghosts and the synchronized fireflies. And then my friends and I got just like super into it, dove deep, loved your R State article, and I'm really excited to hear from you today. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, I'll let you share your screen and take it away.
All right. So let me get this put together like it's supposed to be. And
Yes,
we're successful again, right?
that looks great.
All right. Well, thank you all for your interest in learning more about fireflies. We'll have a good time with it, I think, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions as we proceed through this presentation. So
If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll keep track of them, and we can ask them of you at the end.
that'd be great. All right, so we've had this discussion about whether to call them fireflies or whether to call them lightning bugs, and it really doesn't matter. When I was a kid, I grew up calling them lightning bugs, but then I got educated, and for some reason now I call them fireflies. I don't know why that happened, but the important thing to know is that they're not flies and they're not bugs. So fireflies are actually beetles, and they belong to the family Lampyridae, which means light bearer. To the ancient Greeks, they were the Chysolampus, the ones with the glowing butt. So they've been noticed for a while, I reckon. Um, and they're closely related to a couple other groups of beetles that at least some of which are bioluminescent. We'll talk a little bit later about these guys, the phangodids, the railroad worms or glowworms. But then there are some click beetles that are also bioluminescent. So there are a few other beetles besides the fireflies that have this remarkable ability. Um, Beyond the beetles, there are some flies that are bioluminescent. We'll talk about them briefly later on as well. But we're going to be focusing on fireflies. And in order to understand fireflies and how to identify them, you need to know basically the important pieces and parts of a firefly. So like all beetles, or almost all beetles, I should say, there's 350,000 different beetles in the world, so it's kind of hard to paint to the brush too broadly. But like most beetles, fireflies have modified forewings that we call elytra. All right, elytron's the singular. And in fireflies, those elytra, those forewings, tend to be kind of leathery and flexible as opposed to hard and rigid like they are in many other fireflies. And when we're trying to identify a firefly, the markings on the elytra can be really important at some times. In addition, some other characteristics on a firefly that are really important to pay attention to are the pronotum. So this is this shield that kind of protects the back of the firefly's head. In most fireflies, you can't see the head very well because the pronotum is large enough to sort of hide it from above. And the shape of that pronotum, the shape of these corners, and real importantly, the color pattern of the pronotum can be really helpful in trying to identify a particular species of firefly. Fireflies have compound eyes as adults. Males typically have bigger eyes than females. That's an interesting thing to think about for just a second. The antennae can be a useful characteristic in helping to sort one from another. And then there's this little structure right here behind the pronotum and in front of the elytra called the scutellum. And the color of that and the shape of that can be a useful characteristic as well. Now, some fireflies also have what's called an elytral fold, so it's kind of a longitudinal wrinkle right here along the front edge of the elytra, and that can be useful as well. When you look at the bottom of a firefly, of course, probably the most prominent, most um, interesting structure you see on the underside of an adult firefly are the light organs. And the shape of the light organs, how many segments are involved in having light organs, the presence or absence of little pits in the light organs, all those characteristics can be useful. And then the very tail end of the firefly's abdomen is a structure called the pygidium, and the shape and color of that can be useful in identifying. So, fireflies are compared to many other kinds of beetles, not particularly speciose, but there are a lot. In the world, there are about 2,000 to 2,500 species of fireflies. In the US, we have about 170 species of fireflies scattered across 20 genera, but 4 or 5 of the genera are most important in terms of the actual diversity that we see. In North Carolina, we have right now officially about 35 species of fireflies, but I have a strong suspicion that we have many other species that just haven't been noticed or, for that matter, identified yet. All right, so in North Carolina, some of the genera that are really prominent would include the Photinus fireflies. Photinus means light bearer, basically, again. And this is a typical Photinus firefly. In fact, this is probably the most common firefly in North Carolina. We'll talk more about it a little bit later. The scientific name for it is Photinus pyralis, but we like to call it the Big Dipper because of the way it flashes. So Photinus are probably the most familiar fireflies to most of you, and the ones that you've probably seen most recently in your yards. There are also several species of Photurus, and they're very interesting for kind of maybe a little bit of a dark reason. We'll talk about them a little later. And this is a typical Photurus firefly. They tend to be large. They tend to have long legs. They have some behaviors that are really, really interesting. Now, different genera have different, tend to have different lights. So most of the Photurus are kind of a yellowish, maybe some of them will look greenish to you, but the Photurus typically have a bright green light. And then there's Pyractomina. This is a Pyractomina. These also tend to be fairly large. They almost always have these black marks on the sides of their pronotum. And some of these are the earliest fireflies you're going to see in the spring. So one of them, Pyractomina borealis, I've seen them in my yard in early March. So sometimes they come out really early. And then Phalcis is the blue ghost fireflies. We'll talk more about them in a little bit, but these guys tend to be really tiny and have some really interesting behaviors. All right, so this is a list. I'm not expecting anybody to remember this. I just wanted to show you what the diversity in North Carolina looks like as far as we know now. This is a list of the fireflies that we've identified in North Carolina so far. And you'll notice that there's one here that we don't have a species name for yet. I'll talk more about it a little bit later. So we've got a lot of Photinus. We've got several Pyractomina. and we have several photuris. And then we also have at least 4 species of the Phausis ghost fireflies. Now, I want you to pay attention. Several of these names are in blue. And let's just count them real quickly. There's 4, 5, 6. Why it does. Okay, come on now. There we go. So we got about 8 of these species in blue. And so I put them in blue for an important reason, and that's because not all fireflies are actually lightning bugs. So a fairly significant percentage of fireflies don't have lights. They're day-flying insects that primarily use pheromones to communicate for mates and things of that sort. Now, an interesting thing is that we think most of these day-flying fireflies that don't have lamps evolved from ancestors that did have lamps. But we think that they've evolved day-flying behaviors to avoid nighttime predators. We'll talk more about that maybe a little bit later as well. Now, a lot of these, what we call dark fireflies, where the males don't have light organs, and a lot of them, the females do have light organs. And so they're not completely dark, I guess you can say. By the way, that's one that's fairly common. You may see it in wooded areas around your house. This is Lucidota, really pretty firefly with really odd antennae. This is another one. This is often called the winter firefly. And sometimes you'll see this insect, the adults aggregating in big numbers on trees early in the spring as they prepare to start the mating phase of their life. And then this is another one of the dark fireflies we have in North Carolina. I took this picture in my backyard, actually. And this is Pyropygium minuta, and it's only about 1/8 of an inch long. So it's a really, really, really tiny firefly. So I guess the whole point of this is when you're looking at the diversity of fireflies in your yard, you need to be aware that some of them are going to be out and about during the day and not at night. And they can be an important component of your firefly diversity. All right. So another important thing to recognize is that not all fireflies are even fireflies. There are a lot of insects that mimic fireflies. And they do this because many fireflies, particularly the Phytinus fireflies, but some of the others, are protected by noxious chemicals that they manufacture in their bodies. Some of these are called lucibufigins, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But because many fireflies produce these toxic chemicals, it's to the evolutionary advantage of other insects to look like a firefly and gain some protection through that. So here's a click beetle that's a firefly mimic. This is a soldier beetle. You may have seen them. They're very common on flowers that looks very much like a firefly. That's a longhorn beetle, a longhorn wood-boring beetle that looks like a firefly. And there's a soldier beetle. I'm sorry, a ground beetle, not a soldier beetle. This is a carabid, a ground beetle that's mimicking fireflies. And even some other insects can get into this game. So here's a moth that's a very good firefly mimic. I took this picture up on Grandfather Mountain a few years ago. So lots of insects mimic fireflies. And so therefore, you have to look carefully at the critter that you're looking at to make sure it is indeed a firefly. If that pronotum that we talked about, let me see if I can back that up. That pronotum that we talked about, if it covers most of the head, it's probably a firefly. As you see with this soldier beetle, the head's quite exposed and the pronotum's fairly small by comparison. All right, so course, everybody's really fascinated about fireflies because they produce light. And uh, that across the sweep of insect diversity is a uh, pretty rare uh, ability. And one of the really neat things about firefly light is that it's cool light. And I'm not just trying to, exhibit a 60s vibe there. It's cool because it doesn't produce waste heat. So the way the fireflies make their light is through the interactions of chemicals called luciferins. And in addition to luciferins, they need oxygen. They need a very important enzyme called luciferase, and then they need the cellular fuel that all living cells use to power themselves in the form of ATP. And fireflies can regulate whether the light's on or off, we think primarily by regulating the availability of oxygen uh, to the reaction chambers. So when you look at a firefly's abdomen, those light organs on its abdomen are full of luciferins. And they also, if you look at them, have a dense network of the trachea, the tubes that insects breathe through, scattered throughout them, and so they can turn the light on and off by shutting off or making available oxygen. And again, almost all of the energy that goes into this comes out as light. If you think about all the ways we make light, we waste a lot of that energy as heat. But these insects and most other bioluminescent organisms, for that matter, have figured out how to produce light without wasting that energy as heat. All right, so if we want to talk about the general natural history of fireflies, most fireflies are predators as larvae, and they're very, very aggressive predators on other um, typically soil-dwelling or leaf litter-dwelling invertebrates. So you might have a firefly larva that's only maybe just under a half-inch long that will attack and immobilize a 3-inch long slug and then spend several days or weeks eating it. So they're really aggressive predators. They have mouth parts as larvae that are sort of like hollow fangs, and they do inject their we think most of them anyway do inject their prey with a venom that immobilizes them so that they can eat them. Um, Fireflies occur in a huge range of habitats. Most of those habitats that they use are fairly humid. They don't typically do real well in really, really dry conditions. And each species has its habitat preferences. So if you want to find a particular species, the first thing you have to do is get in the right habitat for it. We'll talk more about that in a second. In many species, the males have wings and can fly, but the females are what we call larviform. And so they don't have wings and they look very much like a larval firefly. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later. And in the vast majority of cases, with some notable exceptions, the adults don't feed much, if at all, as adults. And in fact, some of them don't even have functional mouth parts as adults. So they basically get all the energy that they need to complete their life cycles feeding as larvae. And by the way, this is what one firefly larva looks like. So I believe this is a Photurus firefly larva right here. Kind of looks like a little alligator or dragon or something. Really cool little critters. By the way, most of the larvae are either soil dwelling or they're going to be living under the leaf litter in, say, forest systems. Very, very few of them are going to be off the ground as larvae. Okay. So why do fireflies produce light? How did they come about this ability to produce light? And we think the ability to produce light evolved first as what's called an aposematic signal. So what does that mean? Aposematic signals are basically warnings to predators that if you eat me, you're probably going to be unhappy that you did that. So if you think about like a monarch butterfly, bright orange and black, that color pattern is a signal to predators that eating a monarch butterfly is a bad idea because of the toxins that that insect contains. And we think that the ability of fireflies to make light first showed up in the larvae as an aposematic signal to nocturnal predators and about 141 million years ago. And then the use of bioluminescence as a signal amongst flying adults seems to be about 133 million years old. So basically, as these insects continue to evolve over that intervening, 12 million years, adult fireflies co-opted that ability for a different purpose. And we think that it evolved for the purpose of sexual communication. It's important to recognize that at the time all this was happening, there weren't birds and there weren't bats. The only other predators in the air were other insects and maybe pterosaurs, but I don't know how much attention pterosaurs paid to fireflies. All right, so they use their lights to communicate. That's the main purpose of the light organs in adult fireflies is to communicate. And of course, what they're mostly communicating is their interest in reproducing. So it's all about sex, almost all about sex. And the way it typically works is each species, all right, I already mentioned different genera have different color lights. Each species has its own signaling system, and we'll give you some examples in a moment. But the signaling system would be composed of perhaps the color of the light, the time of the night, where they're active and flashing, and real importantly, the pattern of the flashes. All right. Is it a single flash repeated at some interval? Is it a double flash? Or is it something more complicated? Now, in most species, the male has this particular species-specific flash pattern. And in our fireflies in North America, the males engage in the risky behavior of flying around, advertising their presence while they're looking for females. Now, the females are typically going to be either on the ground or in vegetation, depending on the species, and they're going to be intently watching for males. And if they see a male, make the right species-specific signal and do it really, really well. You can't be doing it halfway. If they see a male that's doing it right, she'll respond with her species-specific response signal. And then they keep flashing at each other in this kind of call and response fashion as the male flies in the direction of the female that he's seen. And then he'll land very close to her, run over. They'll do some weird things with their antennae oftentimes. And if they both are quite happy with the match, they'll go ahead and mate. And in some fireflies, mating can last for a really, really, really long time. And there's an important reason for that. So this is just a real short video I took in my yard. This is Photinus pyralis. And what you see happening here is we've got a pair that are coupled up that are mating. We've got a second male who's trying to horn in, but is not going to have any success. And if you watch in the background, there's yet another male who's interested in the goings on, but is also probably out of luck. By the way, the female is the larger one on the bottom of the pair that's coupled. You see that male back there? So this is, again, this is the Big Dipper, the one that's most common in most yards. Go on. All right. So the Photinus paralis, the Big Dipper signaling system, we call them the Big Dippers because the males have a very characteristic J stroke kind of flash signal. So you'll have to watch this really carefully. I took these videos in my yard as well, but as it turns out, videoing firefly flashes is a technologically pretty challenging thing. And I'm maybe technologically challenged myself. But anyhow, watch. You'll see one approaching the camera. So right there, right there, right there. You see how he's making kind of a J stroke signal? He'll do that about every 3 or 4 seconds. The females are watching on the ground, typically in this species, and if they see a male that they want to signal back to, they'll make a little half-second signal about halfway through that dark phase, and the male will fly on down. This, by the way, is a species that likes to do most of its courtship signaling right at dusk. And so you see them early in the evening. And again, that's probably another reason why they're the most familiar. This is what they look like. By the way, this is a large Photinus, probably the largest one most of us are going to see. And they're really easy to identify because they've got this more or less round mark on their pronotum, dark mark on their pronotum, surrounded by pink. Most of the other Photinus we have will have a bar here instead of this roundish mark. So here's another species of Photinus with a different signaling system. Again, you're going to have to watch real carefully. This is Photinus McDermotti. Some folks call it Mr. Mac. Some folks call it the double tap, but it's got a very distinctive double flash signal. So watch for it, starting off in the left, in the lower left corner. You see two flashes, two flashes, two more flashes. And if you noticed, let me run it again. On the second flash in this species, he'll flash once and then he'll flash the second time. And on the second flash, he always swoops upwards. So that pattern is very distinctive for this species and helps you identify. There's also about a 2.5-second interval between double flashes. So that's another important piece of information. There's a very closely related species that has about a 5-second interval between its double flashes, and it doesn't swoop up on the second flash. So the flash pattern becomes very, very important. This is yet another species that I have in my yard. This is Photinus frontalis. This is a really noteworthy species because of something they do that's pretty remarkable if they're in large numbers. But let me show you the video real quickly. And so what you'll see is there's our firefly. It's kind of faint, but they just flash about every half second. And they don't stop. They just keep flashing. You see them going right across there. All right. The sort of informal common name for this, and this is what this firefly looks like, is the snappy sync, because if there are more than just a few and they can see each other, they flash in perfect synchrony. And so you can go to Congaree National Park in May, if you're lucky and win the lottery, and you can see thousands of these fireflies flashing in perfect synchrony. Now, I showed you these 3 different examples to kind of hammer home the importance of being very observant with the flash patterns when you're trying to identify fireflies, because in some cases, particularly with some of the Photurus fireflies, the only way we can tell them apart is by their flash signals. They're, I'll back up just a second. In lots of insects, we look for morphological differences, so differences in their shape or the shape of structures. And in lots of insects, one of the most useful pieces of the insect anatomy is the adiagus, which is the copulatory organ of the male insect, because they're almost always shaped very specific to a species. But in fireflies, the fireflies rely so heavily on their light signaling systems that in a lot of them, they don't, the genitalia aren't different at all. And so it's almost impossible to look at these fireflies and just look at their shape, their color, the structures on them, and tell them apart. You have to know what the flash signal is, and that makes things kind of complicated. But lots and lots and lots of them can be identified very easily if you're observant of their flash signals. All right. There are some variations on this basic call and response system. There's sometimes species are kind of distinguished by the different intervals between male and female signals. In the Photurus, those big long-legged ones I was talking about, um, to make things even more complicated, sometimes they have multiple different flash patterns that they use at different times. And then some of them use their light for other purposes. And so I'll get to that in just a minute. Now, I'm sure all of you have caught fireflies, maybe as kids, maybe like me, you still catch them whenever you can just for the heck of it, look at them and take pictures of them and whatnot. And you might have noticed that especially these Photinus fireflies have kind of a weird chemically smell. And you might be curious as to what that smells about. Well, we're not 100% certain, but we think it's related to the fact that a lot of these fireflies, as I mentioned earlier, produce these toxic chemicals called lucibufficins. So lucibufficin, by the way, tells you something about the chemical nature of these materials. So luci means they're produced by fireflies. Bufficins means they're chemically related to the toxins that toads produce. They're not the same, all right? And they're fireflies that make them, endogenously in their bodies. But they're chemically related to the same, to the toxins that make toads such poor food for so many animals. All right. So those lucibufficins are not only toxic, but they're really nasty tasting. And again, that explains why so many insects mimic um, mimic fireflies. We think that many fireflies, in addition to lucibufficins, produce other chemicals, and other groups of fireflies but besides the Photinus produce different kinds of toxic chemicals. And we think that I'll get to that in a second. A lot of fireflies, when they're attacked by something, will do what's called reflex bleeding. So they'll actually, at certain points in their body, in this case, this is a Photinus carolinus, by the way, the synchronous firefly from the mountains. Along the edges of the elytra, they can do this. They'll actually exude some of their blood containing those toxic lucibufficins, so that if the predator's trying to eat them, they're going to get a dose of that chemical and probably want to go ahead and drop that firefly. And we think the smell is actually a degradation product of those lucibufficins, or a chemical that's related to the synthesis of those lucibufficins. But that smell may also be, for some predators, kind of a warning not to eat me. All right, so here's a a firefly that's of, I think, particular interest to a lot of people, and that's the mountain synchronous firefly that we have at Grandfather and at Elkmont and Great Smokies and actually in many other places in the mountains of North Carolina. And I'm going to go through its life cycle just as kind of a why it keeps doing that as a demonstration of the general life cycle of a firefly. So um, the range of the mountain synchronous firefly is roughly this area here in the eastern uh, United States. You'll notice it goes all the way up into Pennsylvania and it goes all the way down into Georgia. So there are lots of places where these insects occur. This is a woodland species of firefly. So if you want to see them, you need to get in a hardwood forest, usually fairly close to a stream or on like the north slope where it tends to be more humid. So in this species, the males, when they're singling, fly about 3 to 4 feet above the ground, looking for females that are down in the leaf litter. In this species, the signal is 4 to 8 flashes in pretty quick succession, followed by about 6 seconds of darkness. When you get large numbers of them, they synchronize those dark periods. And so everybody flashes, and then for 6 seconds, the woods go completely dark. And then everybody flashes, and the woods go dark. So it's really, really cool. So again, the females are down on the ground. In this species, on any given night, only a fraction of the females will actually be up and interested in mating. And so the males way outnumber the females. So if males see a female signaling, a lot of times there's going to be a crowd rushing to her. In this species, the female's response signal is 2 faint flashes about halfway through that dark period. And so we think they synchronize, by the way, so everybody gets a chance to look at the other sex and look for the other sex, and then have the chance to detect each other. In this species, females can mate several times. That's not true for all species of fireflies. And again, in Photinus carolinus, when they mate, they copulate for about 12 hours. And they do that because during copulation, the males provide the females a huge nuptial gift that's produced by part of their reproductive system. And that nuptial gift is full of, well, you guessed it, lucibufficants that the female can use to protect herself and her eggs. And then when she gets done mating, she'll lay about 40 eggs, and then she'll die. Those eggs hatch in about 3 weeks. That's fairly typical for fireflies across the spectrum, 3 to 4 weeks before the eggs hatch. And then these guys are, as I said, aggressive predators in the soil as larvae. The larvae, by the way, glow. The eggs glow, and the pupae glow. In Photinus carolinus, they spend the winter as larvae under the soil, leaf litter, or in the soil, and then they pupate in the spring in a little chamber that they excavate underground. And then they come up after 3 weeks or so as pupae, and the adults live for maybe 3 or 4 weeks on the outside. Again, they don't feed as adults, and so all the energy they have available to them for their reproductive careers is energy they harvested as larvae. All right. Like many, many insects, and like most other fireflies, males come up first. They emerge first, oftentimes a week or 2 weeks before the females. And they do that to make sure that they're there ready when the females finally start showing up. They're not going to miss, if they can help it, any mating opportunities. Another firefly that we see in the mountains, and we're going to talk more about these guys a little bit later, is the blue ghost, Phausis reticulata. This is a tiny firefly. This is one of those species where the females are larviform. So this is a male ghost firefly, and this is a female. Ghost fireflies are different from the Photinus and Photurus fireflies in that those species that have lights don't flash, they keep their lights on. Now we call them blue ghosts, but they're not actually blue. The light's actually green. But because their lights are tiny and fairly dim, there's an optical illusion that happens with human eyes that makes green light at any distance, faint green light at any distance, look blue, and that's called the Purkinje effect. And so this is what a still photo of blue ghosts might look like. So they turn their lights on and basically fly low over the forest floor looking for females, which are down in the mouths of their little burrows on the soil. This is a real short video of what blue ghosts look like in real color. Video taken in a light range. They're pretty mystical animals, I think. So in this signaling system,
When the sawdust settles and the engine finally.
one second, let me get this going. So in this signaling system, the both the males and the females leave their lights on. Why the males light up, we're not really sure what the benefit is, but it may help them be recognized by the females as they're approaching. So it's a different signaling system from the other genera. We'll talk more about those guys in a minute, right? So in the ghost fireflies, there are about 10 recognized species. Now I think it's 12 recognized species. Again, they're really, really tiny fireflies. They average about 1/4 of an inch in length and about 80% of those species don't have lights. And the females are wingless and larviform, have little light organs in their abdomens. Most of the males, again, are dark. We already talked about the blue ghost a little bit. So in the ghost fireflies, the females emerge in the spring from their burrows. They're only alive for about 6 weeks. They don't feed as far as we know. We already mentioned that. The males cruise looking for females about 1 to 4 feet above the forest floor. The females mate, I think, one time for these insects, and then they guard their eggs after they've laid them. They usually lay about 30 eggs. They'll curl up around their eggs and they guard them until they die. And then those eggs hatch a couple weeks after she dies. And then the little bitty larvae, again, are predaceous on other soil invertebrates. And we think they have about a year life cycle. So I'm going to kind of go on to a side tangent for a minute here and talk about a really interesting thing that's been going on with myself and some of my colleagues for the last 4 years, and that's that we're trying to sort out the identity of a new species of ghost firefly. And for you folks in Chatham County, it's really important because you're kind of at ground zero for this new species, and I'll mention that in just a minute. But to set this up, I want to show you some pictures. This is the underside of a Phausis reticulata. That's the blue ghost that we see up in the mountains and the foothills. And I want you to notice the shape of the pygidium here, shape of the light organs, and the shape of the pronotum. This is the underside. This is the top side. by the way, it's called reticulata because it's got these little reticulations on its wings. But again, look at the color, the shape, look at the color of the antennae. So this is the mountain blue ghost. As far as we know, robust populations of this insect don't occur any further east than about maybe the vicinity of Newton Conover. All right. So it's a Western North Carolina insect. About 4 years ago, I was contacted by a friend of mine, Lynn Faust, who's a dedicated firefly specialist. And she said that she had gotten a report from a couple that lived in Chatham County, and they said they had ghost fireflies in their front yard, which is 100 miles to the east of where they should be. And she suggested to me, this was during COVID and all, that maybe it would be a good thing for me to do to get out of the house and go look in this lady's front yard and see if she did indeed have ghost fireflies, because Lynn had never visited to see them. So my wife and I hopped in our car in late April, early May, and we drove over to Chatham County to this lady's address. And we got there about almost dark, and we sat there and we waited and we waited and we waited, and we didn't see anything. And then it got full dark, and my wife says, "I think I saw one." And then I looked, and lo and behold, we ended up seeing maybe 15 or 20 of them milling around in her front yard. Now, one of her stipulations was we couldn't collect any of them. She kind of regarded them as her own special friends. And so I did catch one. Well, my wife caught one, and I did get a couple pictures of it, but we let it go. And so we knew there were ghost fireflies there, but we didn't know what kind of ghost fireflies they were. So having that experience, I got on Facebook and I put out the word to my Facebook friends that lived in the area that I was looking for more sites to find these things and maybe collect a few specimens. And in short order, we had a couple other folks from Chatham County let us know that they had them, and lo and behold, they did indeed have them, and we got some material to look at. And then the next year, some colleagues of mine at the Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh and I put together a citizen science project I'll talk about in just a minute to try and learn more about it. All right, so I've shown you what Faustus reticulata looks like. Let's look at this new thing that we have in Chatham County. So if you look at the pygidium here, you'll notice it's got a really deep notch as opposed to the shallow notch we had on the other. You'll notice the light organs are smaller. All right. If you look at it from the top, it's much lighter colored on the pronotum. The antennae are different colors. The elytra look different. It's a different species. And the cool thing is, I should say, I'm pretty confident it's a different species. But the cool thing is that it's not been described. And so we're very interested in learning more about this animal. This is what the female looks like of our what we're temporarily calling Piedmont ghosts. All right. And so that's a side view, and that's a view from the top. This species always has the females always have only two little light organs here in their abdomens. And unfortunately, you can only see the light organs when they're alive. Once they're in alcohol, you can't find the light organs anymore. So we started this little citizen science project. Jerry Reynolds is one of the guys behind it at the Museum of Natural Sciences. And he lives about 1.5 miles from where I do in Clayton. And we started searching around for where we could find these things. We found them in several places in Chatham County. Then we found them in one place in Orange County, and we found them in a couple places in Wake County. And Jerry texted me one day and said, well, do you think there's any point in me looking in my backyard here in Johnston County? And I said, what could it hurt? So he went out that evening with a beer in his hand, and he walked to the back gate of his yard and looked out into the woods behind his house. And he drank about half his beer and didn't see any ghosts, and said, well, I don't have them. And so I got in touch with him the next day, kind of excited to know what he found. And he said, didn't find anything. But then he got to feeling guilty because he didn't look very hard. He didn't go up into the woods where they might be. So the next night he got another beer and went to the back gate. But this time he opened the gate and walked up the hill about 50 yards, drank about half his beer, and lo and behold, there were ghost fireflies all around him. And he got very excited and let me know. And I said, well, that's really cool. And then I got to thinking, he lives less than a mile and a half from where I live. Is it possible that I have ghost fireflies in my backyard that I haven't known about for the 23 years I've lived here? And so the next night I got a beer in my hand and I went down into the woods behind my pond, and I have ghost fireflies in my backyard too. So we don't know a whole lot about these things, but we need to know more about them because they are such cool little critters. So if you're interested in helping out with this, this is the Carolina Ghost Hunt is what we call it. You can Google that and it'll come right up. This is not the time of year to be looking for them, by the way. This is an insect that, as far as we can tell, is active only for a couple weeks in late April and early May. But we very, very much want more people to get out in the woods and see if they have little tiny ghost fireflies flitting around in their backyards. This is what we know of their distribution now. We do have a record from over here in western Montgomery County. We also have a record. I saw somebody who was from Georgia. We also have a record from North Georgia. I'm not 100% certain that it's the same critter, but it looks like the same critter as what we're seeing here in the Piedmont. So it's quite possible that this insect has a much broader distribution than we currently understand. And that's where folks helping us look for them next spring will come in handy. There are other unidentified species of Phausis around as well. I recently got pictures of a specimen from, I think it was from down here, actually, in this part of South Carolina. That's another ghost. It's got lights, but it's clearly not our ghost, and it's clearly not the blue ghost from the mountains. And so the blue ghost does occur in far western South Carolina, by the way. So what I'm getting at, I guess, in this long roundabout way is there are new things to discover right in your backyards. It might be a little weird firefly, but even though naturalists have been studying North and South Carolina in a European tradition anyway for now almost 400 years, there's still new stuff to find. And to me, that's just the coolest thing and the most important take home about our experiences with this undescribed species of firefly. Who knows what else might be out there? You just have to look. I had ghost fireflies in my yard for 23 years before I knew it. And that's because it never occurred to me to go out and look 45 minutes after sunset in early May for a firefly. But yet they were there. All right, enough of that. Okay, Photurus real quickly. So Photurus, as I've mentioned several times, are kind of big. They often have long legs. A lot of them, when you look at them from the side, they're kind of hunchbacked. Photurus are different because about half the species of Photurus, the females are predaceous as adults. So they're the exception to that rule that fireflies don't eat as adults. And not only are they predaceous, but the way they capture their prey and the specific prey they capture is pretty interesting. So in the Photurus species that are predaceous, not all of them are, the virgin females behave like a regular firefly should. They look for males of their species. Most Photurus, by the way, mate high up in treetops. So they sit in the treetops looking for males of their species. And when they see a male of their species, they make the appropriate Photurus signal to them, and everything goes like it's supposed to. But once they've mated, those same females, after they've mated with a male of their own species, on following nights, will watch for male Photinus fireflies. And they mimic, when they see a male Photinus, they'll mimic the female of that species and call that male Photinus down to them. And then once that male Photinus, the poor fellow thinking he's going to be getting lucky, drops down to where that female is, runs over to shake hands, she grabs him and eats him. And so, by the way, I took this picture on my back porch several years ago. And so she's eating him because she is unable to make those defensive chemicals that we talked about earlier, the lucibufigins. And so she's eating him to harvest those protective chemicals and then use those chemicals to protect herself and her eggs from predators. Now, Photurus is a very frustrating group of fireflies to work with because a lot of them look very, very similar. A lot of them within the species are somewhat variable in how they look. A lot of those species, the genitalia that we rely so heavily on with other insects to identify them, are essentially the same. And the only way we can really distinguish them is by their flash patterns. And then to complicate things even more, many of the Photurus have multiple flash patterns as adults. So these are the flash patterns of several species of Photurus. Some of them are very distinct. Some of them are really hard to distinguish. One of the common ones that we have around here is in Chatham County and in most of North Carolina is Photurus versicolor. It's a big predaceous species. It's actually a species complex in all likelihood. But this is a common signaling pattern it has. So what this is it basically has a flash pulse that's actually kind of modulates. And so you have to watch that very, very carefully to see it. Then there's Photurus lucrescens, and I call these the comet fireflies because they start off dim, and then over a course of almost 2 seconds, they get really bright, and then they go dark, and then 7 or 8 or 6 seconds later, they do the same thing again. But these are really, really aggravating fireflies to work with because there is so much variability. And so as a consequence, this is a group of fireflies that we probably have a number of unidentified species in North Carolina. The bottom one here, Photurus tremulans, this is its characteristic flash pattern. So it kind of has this flickering flash, but a lot of the time it also just makes like a really big flash bulb. And you see big numbers of these up in a tree canopy. It looks like Christmas lights flashing off and on. All right, so these are just a couple example species of Photurus. So this is versicolor over here. This is tremulans over here. As you can see, they look very similar out the gate. In the Photurus, the shape of this dark mark in the middle of the pronotum can be really important, and how long these side stripes are can be really important. But again, they can be very, very difficult to identify because they're so variable. This, by the way, is a Photurus larva. Photurus larvae tend to not be in the soil, but they tend to be under the leaf litter. And again, just like the rest of them, they're really vigorous predators. All right. There are, as I said earlier, some other glowing insects in North Carolina and areas around. And so here's one. This is looks like a larva, doesn't it? Well, this is actually an adult female fangoted glowworm. And this is what she looks like in regular light. I'm going to show you a couple pictures that I took a few years ago to show you what the light pattern looks like. So I took this picture on my bathroom floor downstairs at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I took this picture by taking a long exposure in combination with a flash exposure. And so you see what the insect looks like, but you also see where her light organs are. This is just a long exposure by itself. So these are large insects, by the way. This female is almost 3 inches long. And they're called railroad worms because when they're moving through the forest floor, it almost looks like a little subway car or something going through the forest. You'll usually see these things, the adult females anyway, out in May, June, sometimes into July. These guys are predators primarily on millipedes. And so one way to find them during the daytime is to look for dead millipedes that have a glowworm living in them. All right, so that's the female. Let me show you what the male looks like. The male is a bizarre beetle. So that's the male fangoted. It's about 1 inch long. These are its elytra, so it's got really weird front wings. And probably one of the most dramatic features of these fangodids is these huge plumose antennae. And for years, I was puzzled how this thing could mate with that thing. It just doesn't seem like it should be physically possible. But 2 years ago, we actually found a pair coupled in the backyard. And so, yeah, they do it. All right, another glowing insect that's kind of famous is the New Zealand glowworms. So these are actually not beetles, but flies, and they're not adults, but the larvae of a fly, a fungus gnat fly that lives in caves and grottos in New Zealand and Australia. And so I had the good fortune about 20 years ago now, I can't believe how old I'm getting, anyhow, of visiting New Zealand, and we went into the Waitomo caves. It's a pretty spectacular thing. So in this case, the light has nothing to do with reproduction. The light is all about attracting prey. So each one of these glowworm larvae spins a number of filaments of silk that are covered in this sticky mucilage. And then they hang from the ceiling in a little hammock that they make with their fishing lines all tied together and turn their lights on, and insects that come up out of the bottom of the cave, in this case out of the little river that flows through the cave, are attracted to the lights. If you look up, it looks like a starry sky. And so they fly up into those sticky webs, get tangled, and then the larvae haul them up and eat them. So completely different reason for making light from most of the fireflies that we've talked about. We have our own in North Carolina and extending down into northern Georgia at the very least, our own blue glowing fly larva. This is Orphelia fultoni, and it is found in the mountains of North Carolina. Some folks call them foxfire worms. If you want to try and see these guys, it has to be really, really dark. But where I've seen them most commonly is on moist road banks, cut banks where the vegetation has been kept pretty short. And so these guys have, as larvae, have light organs at both their head and their tail. And just like the glowworms in New Zealand, they spin a network of sticky threads around them. They've got another thing going on, and they use their light to attract small insects and invertebrates into their traps. Now, if you look at this picture right here, you see these thickened parts of the webs. Those are actually loaded with a toxin, and so they attract the insect into their web, and then they basically poison them with the chemical that's in these little pockets in the web. Really, really cool. By the way, Grandfather Mountain has large populations of these. So if you ever are lucky enough to draw the synchronous firefly event up there, you can see these guys, blue ghosts, and the synchronous fireflies. All right, so I said all of that. The larvae in these flies live about, I'd say probably about 3 months, maybe 2 months. The adults only live for maybe a week or two, and the adults are not bioluminescent. All right, so one last thing. This is the bluest light produced by any insect in the world, as far as we know. This is a true blue. This isn't a Virginsky effect. This is real blue, and it's pretty spectacular to see a large colony of these on a road bank. All right, so different fireflies require different habitats. If you want to support fireflies, it's important to support those habitats. Photinus pyralis, the Big Dipper, this is a firefly. It's almost like the starling of the firefly world. It can live almost anywhere, but they tend to like open areas and the edges of open areas. That's why they do quite well in lawns. Many of our fireflies, like the synchronous firefly, though, are woodland species and require healthy, well-maintained woodland habitats of one sort or another. So habitat is critical to conserving fireflies. Some of them are wetland species. They'll only occur where they've got this moist soil situation around the edge of the wetland that they can exploit. In other parts of the world, there are actually fireflies that are aquatic as larvae. There are a couple species that are very tightly tied to the savanna habitats we have down east. We have a couple species in North Carolina that are tightly associated with the edges of salt marshes. So habitat's really critical to fireflies. Now, watching fireflies, studying fireflies is a pretty easy thing. If you want to try and survey fireflies, you might want to have someplace to sit. A stopwatch is handy in helping you time flash patterns. Again, that can be really important. If you want to catch them for photographic purposes, a nice soft insect net's useful. It's always good to have something to drink. If you need light when you're working with fireflies, I recommend that you use a red or a blue headlamp. Many fireflies, if you turn a flashlight or any kind of really strong light source, even the light on your phone on, it'll alter their behavior and it may shut them off. So if you want to, if you need a light while you're trying to study your fireflies, try and use a red or a blue headlamp. Now, there's a caveat there. Most insects can't see red. So the vast majority of insects, when they look at something red, they see something black. They don't see red. Several years ago, when we were doing some of our Venus flytrap work, we put some cameras out, time-lapse cameras out on some flytraps to see whether or not anything was coming to the flowers at night. We did a lot of collecting during the day, and we got a large collection of pollinators during the day, but we wanted to see if anything came to those pretty white flowers at night. So we put these cameras on them, and we put red headlamps on the flowers, or aimed at the flowers, to illuminate it so the camera could see something, because our time-lapse cameras weren't night cameras. And we came back the next day and looked at our video, and lo and behold, fireflies were all over the flowers on the Venus flytrap. And the first thought that ran through my head was, oh, here we go. This is National Geographic stuff. One of the most charismatic plants in the world, pollinated by one of the most charismatic insects in the world. This is great. So we went out the next night to collect some fireflies off the flowers to see how much pollen they were carrying. And so we went out into the savannah with our red headlamps and our nets, and they flew to our red headlamps. They weren't attracted to the flowers at all. They were attracted to the red. And so red may not be the best color either for your headlamp. All right. If you have a small pen lamp, which they're becoming harder and harder to find, that might be a useful tool as well if you want to get a close look at some fireflies. And we'll talk about that maybe in a minute. Real importantly, important threats to fireflies would include habitat loss and habitat damage. It's important to remember that a lot of these fireflies do not have very good dispersal abilities, especially those species where the females are wingless. So if a population is lost or compromised to some kind of disturbance, it can take a very, very, very long time for fireflies to recolonize that area. So habitat maintenance is really, really important. So big threats would include habitat loss, fragmentation, non-native plants like microstygium may compromise the ability of some fireflies to communicate if they can't see through that dense vestiture of grass. There's some evidence that some of the invasive shrubs in more northern areas interfere in a similar way. One of the most important threats to fireflies is light pollution. They use light to communicate for reproduction. And so if there's lots of extraneous light in the environment, it can compromise their ability to communicate. On top of that, many of these guys are confused by artificial lights, just like moths are, and they'll end up wasting their time walking around or flying around an artificial light rather than being out in the woods looking for a mate like they should be. So light pollution is a very real threat to fireflies. This is particularly important for those species that don't start their courtship activities until it's flat dark. And that's a lot of them. And of course, insecticides are another threat to fireflies. Now, the vast majority of fireflies that live in wooded habitats probably don't experience a lot of exposure to insecticides, but fireflies in urban, suburban habitats could be quite seriously affected by things like area spraying for mosquitoes. So, remember that most fireflies have life cycles that last at least 1 year. So they have to have stable habitats during that time span to complete that life cycle. It's important to remember that the larval stages are subterranean or live under the leaf litter, and that habitat needs to be protected. Protecting the habitat for particular species is really, really paramount. One of the species of Photinus that doesn't occur here but occurs in New Jersey was recently listed as an endangered species because it's a marshland species and occurred in a very small geographic area, and those marshes have largely been developed. So habitat loss is critical. Already mentioned that, and don't use insecticides if you can possibly help it. By the way, if you're out and about looking for fireflies at night, I don't think using insect repellents to keep mosquitoes from biting you is a problem. I think you can do that without any risk to the fireflies. Just try not to handle them with insect repellent coated hands. And then real importantly, limit light pollution. And everybody can do this. If you've got outdoor lighting around your house, only have it on when you need it on. Don't leave security lights and things like that on all night, because one light, say mercury, well, not mercury vapor, but one of the large security lights glowing all night can have an impact on a very large geographic area and confuse fireflies for a very long distance away from that light. All right, so I guess I've taken a lot of time to talk about fireflies, so now I guess we'll see if we can answer some questions if there are questions.
Oh, there are questions.
Great. Let's do it.
Yes, I told y'all this presentation would be lit. This was really great. Yeah, that was awesome. I've already learned so much. We've got lots of discussions and questions. My mind is just reeling though from the fact that the blue ghost fireflies are actually green. I stitched these onto my hat on my way home from Grandfather Mountain, and now I'm like, oh no, I gotta rip them all out and go
Oh no.
green.
No, that's all right. If it looks blue to you, then it's blue.
Now it's the dress all over again. Okay, so we've got some questions. So I took questions sort of throughout. So some from the earlier time. Do most of the fireflies mate at dusk? You said it can take a long
No,
time.
no. In fact, Photinus pyralis is kind of exceptional in how early they start coming out. The Big Dippers. Most fireflies are going to become most active. So everybody says, well, it's getting dark. Well, sunset, it's not dark at sunset, right? It's not going to be dark for a half hour to 45 minutes after sunset. And a lot of fireflies don't start their activity until that flat dark, half an hour, 45 minutes after sunset. And some of them will start when it gets full dark, and they'll still be calling, like the snappy sync ones, the Photurus frontalis. They'll still be flying around calling at midnight. So no, most of them are actually going to be more active when it gets flat dark.
Much later at night. Okay.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And so are there any that mate during the day? You said some are active during the day.
Well, yeah, all those dark fireflies, the ones where the males don't have light organs, almost all of them mate during the day. So
okay.
that those 8 species that were in blue, they mate during the day.
And so those dark fireflies, you said the males don't light up. To be considered a light firefly, do both the male and females light up?
Yeah. So yeah, we generally think of the I guess you could call them the lighting fireflies as ones where the males and the females both have light organs. Yeah.
Okay.
If the males are dark, we call them dark fireflies, and they're probably mostly diurnal. Yeah.
Okay. And are fireflies territorial, or can different species flash together?
Oh no, so my yard, I've got kind of a weird yard. I've got about 4 acres. Part of it's lawn, part of it's woods, and I got a pond a little over an acre in my yard. And I've got 14 species of fireflies in my yard, including the three species of day flyers. So you can, over the course of a single evening, as different fireflies become active, you could see in the same space, you could see 3 or 4, maybe even 5 species of fireflies. Um, I frequently will in my yard, and especially in May and early June, it's not unusual to see 3 or 4 species um, in a night in
And
the
it seems like,
same habitat. Yeah.
and Allison seems to have that in her yard too. And she has some that are kind of lower in the lawn earlier and then later up in the treetops. Is the location, just the vertical location, an indicator of different species as well?
Absolutely. So most of them have an altitude they like to fly at. The Big Dippers, they like to fly 2 or 3 feet above the lawn. But if they go over a bush, they'll be 5 feet over the lawn because there's 3 foot of bush underneath them. So,
Right.
but a lot of the ones that you see high up in the trees those are gonna oftentimes gonna be mostly Photurus species or Pyractomena species. They tend to like to be high up in the trees too. So yeah, the altitude definitely is an indicator. The blue ghosts, they like to be just within a foot or two of the ground because they're looking for a little tiny light.
Yeah. And do they seem to care about air temperature? And do they only come out in particular air temperatures in their range, or are other indicators more important?
So no, air temperature is very important. Um, so with the ghost fireflies, they're typically not going to be very active, or at least the males won't be very active, um, unless it's over about 60 degrees.
Hmm.
All right. And, most fireflies the bulk of those species are going to be most active in North Carolina from, say, maybe late April into through June. And most of them are pretty much done by the end of June, but there are a couple species that don't show up until July.
Hmm.
Uh, so I saw somebody had fireflies in their yard the last couple nights. It's quite possible that they're a little species called uh, Photinus australis. So, but air temperature is definitely an important thing, and then weather has a big impact. If it's really, really windy on a given evening, a lot of times they won't do anything because they can't fight the wind. And if it's raining hard, a lot of times that'll shut them down. But a light rain doesn't usually seem to bother them very much. But temperature is definitely important. And temperature also, by the way, is important when you're trying to sort them out because the warmer it gets, the quicker they tend to flash. And the cooler it is, the slower they tend to flash. And that can
Oh,
have a bearing on who you think you're looking at, um,
yeah.
trying to sort them out. Yeah.
Well, and are videos helpful when you're trying to sort it out? Like sometimes are you maybe not able to just do it right there on the fly without your handy chart? I'm sure you're able to at
If
this point, but
if you
taking a
no
video and
no
then
no it's if you can get a video, that's always very useful.
okay.
You can get a decent video of the flash pattern, and then ideally, if you can, catch one of them and get a couple of pictures of it, that all will make it easier. I forgot to mention, but I'll mention it real quickly. Can y'all see that book?
Oh yeah.
All right, this is an awesome reference for Eastern fireflies. This is Lynn Faust wrote this book, and this is without a doubt the best resource going for fireflies in Eastern North America. And so, if anybody's as batty as I am about these things, I would really encourage you to get this book. Um, and by the way, for the Georgia contingent, it's from the University of Georgia Press. So
Oh,
uh,
good. And the Georgia contingent wanted some specifics on where in North Georgia you were hunting ghosts.
So we'd love to have information from anywhere in Georgia. It's quite possible that there are lowland ghosts in Georgia, just as there are in South Carolina. So, but uh, with the ghosts right now, the best situation in the world is if you could get me some. and put them in alcohol and send them to me. That's what I really need.
And
But
despite the rest
anytime,
of this presentation, when he says alcohol, I think he means rubbing alcohol, not beer.
well, what I really mean is the best alcohol is ethyl alcohol. So
Ooh, all
Everclear,
right.
Everclear is the best alcohol to put bugs in.
Whoa, that is not what I learned in college. All right.
But anyway, um, we'd love to have some more material, some more specimens, to help us sort these things out. But I'm pretty sure we got at least a couple new species, and it's quite likely that there's more in Georgia as well. There are a couple folks in the Georgia University system that are working on fireflies, and so I don't want to, steal stuff from their turf, but for the ghosts, it'd be great if we could get more material from anywhere, and certainly more records.
And we'll link this the Carolina Ghost Hunters website, Ghost Hunt website that you said, and there's some how to participate and everything. Is that a good way to
Yeah.
get in touch with you to share that information as people gather?
And I'm glad to have anybody email me as well. You can find my email address on the NC State University directory very easily, but it's Clyde_Sorensen at ncsu.edu. Pretty straightforward.
All right, great. Maybe one of my co-conspirators can throw that in the chat for me too. Okay, we've still got plenty of questions for you.
Yeah.
With the video question, how long should someone record a firefly to like confirm the pattern?
You want to get at least 3 or 4 flash sequences would be great.
And is a sequence
Yeah,
like
so
one flash or
I showed you when I showed you the McDermott. So there were 3 flash sequences in there. It flashed twice, and then almost 3 seconds of dark, flash twice. That's 2 flash sequences.
okay.
Yeah. So
All right.
at least a couple, but the more the better.
Yeah. And with the ones that synchronize, how do they do that? Do we know?
Well, we sort of know. We're
Okay.
working on it. So with the frontalis, the snappy sinks, which I have in my own backyard, if they can see each other, they'll synchronize. And so what you see happening is these that are over here see the ones that are close to them and they synchronize, and then the ones that are a little bit further away see the ones that are closest to them. And so you almost see a wave of synchrony. It's almost like watching a wave in a football stadium as it goes across. And it also happens with the mountain synchronous fireflies.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of effort going in to try and figure out exactly how they do it.
Okay.
Because the mountain synchronous fireflies synchronize in a different way. They're synchronizing their dark periods, whereas the congaree synchronous fireflies are synchronizing the flashes. So
Right.
they're,
Well,
in other words, we don't know.
right. Well, Nancy is on to something. She said she saw fireflies doing the wave in Eastern North Carolina in August. So that sounds like maybe it would match up.
August.
Yeah, August seems a little late.
Where was that?
She just says Eastern North Carolina. I don't know, Nancy, if you want to add any more to your story in the chat.
What was the flash pattern too?
Well, now you're pushing me. I don't know. She just
Yeah, the
said they were doing the
frontalis.
wave.
So the frontalis that I have in my yard they've been done for 3 weeks. They've pretty much wrapped up 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Oh yeah. Okay. So
So
we're getting to the
that
tail
have to
end.
be a different critter, and it may be that's a Phaturus species too.
Okay.
But it'd be great to know something more about the flash behavior.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have these 2 species that we know synchronize very effectively. But the more we look at it, the other species will synchronize, but to a much less comprehensive extent. So you only get a few individuals for a very short time synchronizing. Yeah.
And so with the synchronization, apparently they're communicating in large groups. Have there been attempts by scientists to communicate with the fireflies to not just accidentally change
So,
their behavior with your red light story there, but maybe intentionally?
so when I said you might want to use or have a pen light, you can actually call fireflies to you with a pen light.
Ooh.
So the Big Dipper, for instance, if you see a male, you have to have a pen light that you can, you know, that only goes on when you push the button and goes off immediately when you let go of it. But if you see a male, put that pen light in your hand and you see him flash, count 1, 2, and flash for half a second. And then he'll flash again, 1, 2, flash again. He'll come down and land right on your hand.
Oh, cool.
So you
So,
don't have to chase them all over the pasture with a jar. You can just
right.
have
Oh, yeah, man, I was working too hard
it.
as a kid.
So
Okay.
if you know the flash signaling pattern, you can oftentimes call them to you. Yeah.
So has that been used for conservation efforts at all? We've got, a
No,
lot of
just a
concern
neat
about what you
trick.
said. Sorry.
No, it's just a neat trick.
But I wonder if you could, over a season, draw, if you knew that one piece of property was going to be developed or
Oh,
disturbed, if you could draw them
yeah.
to an adjacent property that, say, Triangle Land Conservancy owned, so that
Well,
you can make sure they're going to be in a safe habitat for
th-
their
that
mervals.
would probably be pretty technologically challenging, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll just send all our volunteers out there with pen lights and see what happens. Um, okay. Do species of fireflies have host plants kind of similar to butterflies?
No, so they don't eat plants. Um, but
Very
they do
carnivorous.
they do have relationships to particular kinds of habitats. So the mountain synchronous fireflies like hardwood forests. That's where you're going to see them.
Okay.
But they don't feed on plants, and so they don't really have any tight association with particular species of plants. And the adults, um, they may drink if they have mouth parts, but they don't for the most part eat, and so they're not going to really have a tight association with particular plants either.
And so you've got your party crowd here. We love the idea of science that can be done with a beer in our hand, wondering, maybe the beer is actually helping and attracting the fireflies. And with these, what was it called? Lucibufficans,
Yeah.
being so similar to those toxic toads of New Zealand. If one licks the back of a firefly, would they have a similar impact to the
Well,
toad?
so a few years ago, I convinced one of my graduate students to pop one in his mouth,
People will
and
do
that,
anything for an internship.
his mouth was numb for about 45 minutes.
Oh my
So
God.
maybe not the best idea in the world.
Wow, but he did it for science. So, okay.
Yeah, he did it on a dare, but why crumble do things to people? So
Wow. All right. Okay, we've got some great Firefly stories here in the chat. Okay, so with this new species, I saw on your list of the black and blue Latin names of all the fireflies. If you are the only one deciding, what would the new species, the Chatham firefly, be called in Latin? And what would you give it its common name? I know you said Piedmont ghost is maybe
yeah, I
10.
like Piedmont Ghost as a
Good.
common name, but yeah, we will have to give some thought to a Latin name. It's a fairly involved procedure to describe a new species. We got to compare it to the others species and identify what's distinct. We're also probably going to do some genetic analysis to see how genetically distinct it is. But uh,
Wow.
one of the first places where we uh, um, collected some was a fellow who works at the Arboretum. His daughter uh, got really excited about him, so it might be kind of cool to name it after her.
Oh man, that would she'll
So
never that she will have peaked though. How do you get cooler than having
well,
a firefly named after
yeah,
you? Wow.
we'll make a decision. My colleagues may have something to say about it too. So
Well, as the Chatham Conservation Partnership Steering Committee member here, I feel like Chatham should enter into the name, but y'all do
well,
you.
I mean that might be possible too. So
I saw a Pennsylvania named one up there, so
oh
I
yeah,
feel like
yeah, yeah.
Chatham's just
Well,
as
and
cool.
that one actually may not be valid anymore because it's um it looks like it's a complex of species.
Oh, really?
The tourists are just a mess. They're just a mess. Yeah.
Oof, man, yeah, they've been flying under the radar and confusing y'all for years, it
Yeah.
seems.
Yeah.
So we've had some people
So
who have
real
tracked.
quickly, I'm
Yeah, go
sorry to
ahead.
interrupt you, but somebody asked the name of the book is Fireflies, Glowworms, and Lightning Bugs by Lynn Faust is the book I was recommending. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. And it looks like some people have linked it also in the chat.
Good.
So definitely take a look at that. And seems like if you're trying to identify what you have in your backyard, that's a good one to have in your home library. Okay, and so some people have been to visit some of these fireflies, including at Dollywood, and there was a lot of nearby construction at the time, and a ranger said that the dry weather and the construction had really impacted the populations. Does anyone know if the fireflies have rebounded there?
I don't know about that particular population. Elkmont, uh, we had, I'm associated with a class, field course that we teach every summer for the wildlife and fishery students. And they were up in Great Smokies, and they had a pretty good experience with them at Elkmont this year.
Oh,
Um,
okay, that's
so,
good.
but drought's not good for fireflies.
Yeah.
Dry weather, really dry weather is not good for them. And I've got a little bit of a concern. These little micro droughts that we keep having could be having an impact on populations of some species anyway. Because those little bitty larvae, it doesn't take very much for them to dry out if they're in the wrong spot at the wrong time.
Yeah. We've got quite a few habitat questions here. So along with the drying, do with prescribed burning, I know that was in your bio, so that's something you're familiar with too, of course. Is prescribed burning of early succession areas in late summer or fall, does that have a less of an impact than if we were to do a spring or growing season burn?
So, the species that are associated with savanna habitats obviously evolved mechanisms for coping with burning. So
Okay.
the pre-colonial burn pattern was a growing season burn. So, you know, those species that we see in savannas, they handle it one way or the other. And it may be that, most of those larvae are actually in the drains that burn very, very infrequently anyway. But yeah, it's certainly a possibility that a burn could have an impact. If it's early successional habitat, I guess I'm wondering, are you talking about like brushland or um, uh, grassland?
Yeah,
Um, it's probably not going to have that big an impact on their populations.
because they're more likely to be in the forested area.
Well, that and if they're in that kind of habitat, they're also probably likely to be subterranean. Uh,
Okay.
and if they're more than an inch or so down, a prescribed fire that has very short residence time, it's probably not going to hurt them. Yeah.
Okay. So I've got a few more questions here, and then we'll have a minute for community announcements if anyone has any of those that they want to make. All right, so with the light pollution, do amber colored bug light bulbs actually reduce nocturnal insect deaths as opposed to the white and blue lights?
They may. They're different lights definitely have have different attractants. So if you want to try and avoid attracting not just fireflies, but in insects in general, if you can try and find lights that have less emission in sort of the ultraviolet end of the game, um, that's good. So, and yellow lights do that. Yellow lights don't have a lot of that emission. I have this project that I've been doing for years. I call it my porch light moth project. And so I take pictures of the moths that come to my back porch, and then I identify them from the pictures. And I've seen 575 species of moths on my back porch. Uh, but I-
575?
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
575. Um, but I've noticed that some lights, especially some of the LED bulbs, don't attract insects very well at all. And
Oh,
so,
okay.
you know, you might play around with it and end up with a bulb that still gives you illumination that doesn't look weird, like
Right.
a light, but that doesn't really attract the insects all that well either.
Okay. Well, that's
So
good.
one of the ones that I had that doesn't attract insects very well at all is one of these compact LED um, lights made to kind of simulate an incandescent bulb.
Okay. And pathway lights, there's several questions about pathway lights. Are those low solar pathway lights, those are also maybe keeping fireflies away from native plant areas and
So yeah, and the pool of light that each one of those emits is pretty limited.
uh-huh.
So it's probably not going to have, it's certainly not going to have the same impact as a security light on a telephone pole would by any stretch.
Okay.
So I mean, you know, I wouldn't be as concerned about those kinds of light sources as I would really bright sources that are higher up and call for
Okay.
them. If you think about the cone of light that a security light puts out versus one of those path lights, you know, security light's got a cone of light
Right.
that might be 50 yards wide, and that path light's only illuminating a circle of about 2 or 3 feet, maybe. So I
Okay.
wouldn't be as concerned. But at the same time, you know, however you can minimize light's probably good.
Right. Yeah, so some people are saying maybe they could not use them from late April to late May
Yeah,
as a particular
yeah.
way to lessen their impact. Okay. Great. All right, let me see if I can grab one more to close us out. Okay, so we had commonly see a type of firefly lighting at the same time as the Big Dipper that has a yellow-orange night light, but does not have the J stroke flight. Any idea what that might be?
Um, it's yellow orange would suggest to me Pyracmina, that genus. Um, so it might be like Pyracmina angulata. It depends on the flash pattern. That might be a species that it could be, but they tend to be more on the amber side of the color spectrum. But there are also a lot of Photuris that fly at the same time of the year as the Big Dipper. Um, and oftentimes they'll start because they're trying to catch males.
Yeah.
they'll start flashing fairly early in the evening too. So yeah,
Okay.
and the those Photuris, by the way, I mean they'll hunt them down and snatch them out of the air. They're pretty remarkable predators.
Wow. Okay. And do these species crossbreed?
Um, generally no, generally no. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think that happens very often. Yeah.
And how many males do the females eat at night in a night? Sorry.
I don't know, but I suspect they'll eat as many as they can catch,
Yeah.
and it takes them a while to I mean, you know, when one catches one, it takes her probably half an hour or more to finish eating it. So the window might not be all that broad to eat too many of them, you know, before
Right.
the
So
mate.
I imagine they have a capacity at some point, but
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, and so for those of us trying to make a little habitat patch in our little corners of the world, how large do you feel like a habitat area needs to be in order to attract fireflies?
Well, I mean, in my yard, I've got several different species, um, and I've got a patch of woods at the head of my pond that's probably not much more than a quarter of an acre, but yet
Okay.
I've got uh, frontalis living in there. I've got McDermott living in there. I've got sanguinis living in there. I've got a couple species of Photurus banging around in there. So it doesn't take a lot of habitat. Um, but again, if you got a lot of extraneous light around it, it's probably not,
Right.
dark is good. Yeah, it probably is.
Great.
Yeah. And habitat diversity is good.
Yeah.
So the Pyralis, the big dippers, they like open areas. If you want to have them around, it's not bad to have some open area.
Yeah.
Several of them are going to be kind of woodland edge species.
Yeah, I see them. Well, I only live on a tenth of an acre, but I've got a little kind of wooded area at the back, and I see them transitioning from the open
Yep.
to the open to the sort of wooded area back and forth a good amount. So trying to keep our little patches. Um, Great. Well, thank you so much. This has just been wonderful. And yeah, we'll have to make sure to remind people of this when our season comes around next year. Have you gotten good feedback this year from your
We
ghost
got a,
hunt?
we got a, we got a few new records this year.
Great.
But more's better.
All right. Well,
And
everybody will, yeah, we'll look out and we'll send that website out and we can start chilling our beers for next season.
yeah, well, I'd be very interested, if there are folks that have populations, if they could let us know early, because we would love to get a little bit more material, a few more specimens in hand before we start really trying to hammer this thing closed.
Okay, so maybe reach out if you think you saw some this year, so that we can be prepared for
Please.
next year. And I think you mentioned Leave the Leaves, but that's a kind of
Yep,
ongoing campaign for
yep, yep.
habitat for those ground dwelling species. So that's a good practice over the winter, something that we can do to make sure that next year we have a great firefly season. Yeah.
Very good.
So does anyone have any like public announcements that we need to make of events or anything coming up that we should know about? If you want to either raise your hand or unmute and just tell us about it, that would be great. I'm not sure. I don't know that I have any, but just in case. Great. Lots of love for you in the chat. This was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. So
Enjoy
we'll
doing it.
we'll send out a follow-up email. Oh, I did forget to ask if you mind sharing your slides. Well, we've recorded the presentation, but a couple people asked about sharing slides.
Yeah, not a problem.
Okay, great. Yeah, you had so much wonderful information in here. Up and Moth Weekends or Moth Week started this weekend. So if you want to try and beat Clyde on his 575 species of moth, it seems like you have through the weekend to show your love for the Lepidopteras over there and start recording. So yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, I'll share the slide set with you. It's a huge um, file, so it'll have to go through Google Drive. I'll get it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we can probably post it on the Chatham Conservation Partnership website if that's okay with you. Um and yeah, but that was wonderful information. So people are very grateful to be able to look back at it. And my friend who actually did the hard work and joined the lottery and everything for Grandfather Mountain is working right now. And I promised her that this meeting would be recorded and that I would share all the information. So glad I get to keep my promise. I wore my Firefly shirt for the occasion. So
Did you get good numbers of fireflies when your grandfather?
Yes, we did. Yeah, there were really good
This year?
numbers, and we saw several of the ghost ones. That was my favorite bit. The synchronization was very cool as well, but I got really giddy when we saw, I mean,
Yeah,
probably only like a dozen of the ghost fireflies, but whenever I
yeah.
saw one walking
So,
along, I was so excited.
so the ghost fireflies actually peak before the synchronous fireflies do.
Oh,
And
okay, that makes
if they
sense
peak
then.
up there, there could be hundreds of ghosts. It's
Wow.
really pretty spectacular. Yeah. Was that this year?
Last year.
And then where the viewing
Oreo.
is, the bank over there has got the Orphelia on it.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah, and they did a wonderful job with the introduction and the talking about some conservation things, and yeah, that's sort of
They're
piqued
good.
my interest. So that's how I found your article, and now I know everything. So
I've
thank
been
you
up
so
there
much
this
for being
year.
so generous.
I'd have been up there this year, but I was in Europe. So,
Oh, yeah, I guess there's thousands of firefly species across the world. Are there, did you see many on your trip?
so there are species in Europe, but it got dark so late that we were always in bed before
Oh,
it got
right.
when we were in
Yeah.
Scotland, it really didn't, and in Iceland for sure, it didn't actually get dark. So,
Wow. Oh
so
man,
yeah,
yeah, I didn't
we
even think.
didn't see
Well,
any because we couldn't stay up that.
you glad you're not a firefly scientist in Northern Europe then, huh?
Well, they probably peak earlier in the year, and so
Right.
when the days aren't quite 24 hours long yet. But yeah,
Yeah. Whew,
yeah.
goodness.
I have an issue with if it's still light out, I still want to be doing stuff, and so we had to force ourselves to go to bed. So, but
And there is a moth event this Saturday at Prairie Ridge Eco Station. So yeah, if you're this has sparked your need for insect tracking, mothing for science this Saturday, 8:30 p.m. to midnight. So you will have to stay up kind of late, but sounds like it'll be worth it.
yep.
And I am gonna stop our recording. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us.